Good morning, everybody. In the spirit of Juneteenth, we discuss how diversity drives both justice and technical excellence in AI. Inclusion isn't just ethically right, it's technically smart. There's mathematical proof of the value of diversity, and diverse problem solving groups consistently outperform homogeneous high performers. We will transform your understanding of collective intelligence and decision making. The best group is not a group of the best. Groupthink is anti-diversity. And Google research found that teams with diverse perspectives in environments of psychological safety delivered higher performance across all metrics. A quote from their research: "The key to high-performing teams isn't getting the right people, but creating the right environment for diverse perspectives to thrive." And the case for inclusion in both training data and in AI development teams is solid. Diversity and inclusion don't just make AI more fair, they make it more effective. Diversity isn't just about inclusion for fairness, it's groupthink prevention. Today is June 19th, 2025, and this is the Daily AI Show. And today I'm joined by Beth Lyons and Junmi Hatcher. To kick this off, I want to talk about a few research studies that came to mind when I thought about this question. The first one is the wisdom of crowds, and the key this key event that drove the wisdom of crowds, which was a Suriweki book actually. I forget his first name, was a study in 1906. A statistician, Francis Galton, made an astounding discovery at a county fair in Plymouth. He asked 800 people to guess the weight of an ox. Of course, this is a diverse crowd at a Plymouth County Fair, and many of them wouldn't have the faintest idea of how many pounds a typical ox weighs. But some of them in the audience might know. But weighing oxen back in those days was probably not an a common occurrence. But the average guess, when they averaged all the 800 people's guesses, was 1,197 pounds. The actual weight, 1,198 pounds. They were 1 pound off. And this is the foundation of the book, The Wisdom of Crowds, which is that collective intelligence from diverse persons in a crowd outperformed any individual expert's prediction, a mathematical foundation for why diversity of perspective and data matters. The second one that I want to talk about is Google's Project Aristotle. This is from, I don't know, about a dozen years ago, I think. But Google spent years studying 180 teams inside Google around the world to discover what makes them effective. And their surprising finding was that it's not about who is on the team, it's how the team works together. There has to be psychological safety so that diverse perspectives within the team can surface. And you know how someone who's taking all the airtime and who has a dominant sort of airtime method can kind of cow the rest of a team into following along and entering into groupthink. But teams with diverse perspectives, and importantly, diverse backgrounds and points of view, were the key delivering the key dynamics of effective teams. Okay, then there's another thing, which is this research done more recently by Lu Hong and Scott Page, uh, arriving at a mathematical principle that proves the value of diversity, that diverse problem-solving groups consistently outperform homogeneous high performers, and cognitive diversity reduces collective error through varied perspectives. So a crowd's strength is not just the individual's talents, but it's the diversity of their thinking. You have to get diversity in there in order to arrive at collective accuracy. And they came up with a mathematical formula, which is that collective accuracy is equal to the average of the individual accuracies plus a factor for diversity. And if you put those two things together, this is the wisdom of crowds concept, the average of individual accuracies, and you ensure diversity, you get higher collective accuracy. And what happens when diversity is missing? Well, that's the real source of AI bias, and that has real world impacts. So groupthink is the root of AI bias. And if you think about how groupthink occurs, just think about social media today. If you are following your own algorithm and you're collecting information only from those people who have the same point of view as you do, then you're falling into the blind spots that come from groupthink. And there's a lot of characteristics of that, where by contrast, diverse teams challenge assumptions. They create a more representative training data set, and they are better at identifying edge cases, right? Bring in diversity, and you're going to find the full range of all the edge cases. So we're making the technical case here for inclusion with measurable outcomes. And so, with that introduction, I turn it over to my colleagues for further discussion. Diversity and inclusion aren't something to be squashed by the government.
So, Andy, I think that's really interesting because it wasn't until the end, what you just wrapped up with, that it kind of really hit home for me about the culture in which the diversity gets expressed, right? Because diversity surfaces the edge cases, but only if it does surface, right? Like, who if you're diverse, um, if you've created this diverse universe, but the price of becoming part of the diverse universe is to play like everyone else in the diverse universe, that's not diversity, right? Like it is diversity on a surface, but if you can't speak up about your diverse perspectives,
Yeah,
then that's not that's
exactly. Excellent
that negates it.
conclusion. It's that's this idea that Google came up with, which is psychological safety is as or more important than the diversity of opinion in there. Because if you are only going to voice what is politically correct in the group, which is dominant, thinking, group
Right.
thinking, then you don't have it. Psychological safety means that the most marginal member of the group has a voice.
Ooh, June me.
This is I mean, this is definitely some great highlights, right? About a topic that is far ranging, and it's one of those kinds of things that I think are difficult to actualize or visualize, mainly because we don't see immediate kinds of um, reactions or counter reactions and things like that. These are things that affect um, in the case or the context of AI on a mass scale or at a very high level, and then it permeates through the entire product. So, in the context of AI, this brings up the conversation about how diversity and inclusion concepts are approached, right? It's been a discussion since the mainstreaming of the AI discussion, and we have seen quite a few examples of where there has either been a tone deaf response or something just didn't work. For example, Google is famous for just adding in some corrective instructions at the very tail end, and we saw that to disastrous results, right? It just did not function. So this gave us some learnings of, nope, this is not something that you can just tack on. You have to go back to the beginning, and that's probably what didn't want to do, because that requires more forethought in the preparation for developing an AI, and identifying and going through the data that you're using and how you're using it, right?
Mhm.
And so the common thinking now is that to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen, right, or those errors or those types of errors don't happen, is to go in from the very beginning. That's like into the training data, into that ingestion process. And of course, to do the one thing that while they're making inroads, have still not have cracked open and identified, and that's the whole black box, right? What are these? How is the thinking happening? How are the conclusions being made? How are the patterns or thought processes, reasoning processes, all going within the AI itself? And and that's probably one of those key parts that needs to be figured out before we, you know, crack the problem, right? Um, but what we can do right now is approach what kind of data are we collecting? Has it been seen from outside perspectives? And this might only be solved um, or properly addressed by the inclusion of a more diverse uh, developer set, in the sense of what we make is, of course, through our lens, right? And like things that Andy was talking about earlier, is if we're the ones who are making the AI, we need alignment. So this might be a human alignment question as well, right? We need more facets or more lenses to be able to view the process than simply what our typical group uh, of developers, researchers, scientists, things like that go in through creating AI. So,
I want to touch on this term alignment because as soon as you use that term, the cognitive space that's triggered for me is alignment with the central objective of the dominant culture, right? Or just alignment with the overall rather than the universal and inclusive edge cases of the collective. So the question is, how do we train or prompt AI to be in alignment with the need to bring in diverse perspectives? Often when I'm thinking about prompting an AI, I'm wanting to get the predominant connotation or result as opposed to the fringe cases. I am interested in the fringe cases as an oddity, but I think it's important to figure out how in our training data sets and in our ways of prompting, or even if at the system prompt level, we encourage AI to balance, right? To bring in balanced perspective in every response that it generates, or not everyone, but when invited, it ought to, and we ought to have a practice for the purposes of alignment with the broad, reality of the diverse uh, perspectives and opinions that exist out there. We ought to always ask for what's the central point and what's the counterpoint. What are the various aspects of it that don't fit with the main thesis of whatever it is that I'm asking you about?
Right. And AI being a predictive machine also has an internal bias, not just because the data itself isn't diverse, but because probability, right? The function of probability is giving you the most probable, or the right, or even the top. Maybe you ask for like more for a higher temperature, a lower temperature, so you're gonna get a more random response. That's still a probability function, right? We're still in the venue of things that are more and less probable, and the definition to a certain extent of diversity unless you've gone out and gotten 2.5 of everything that you're trying to represent is, um, is that is that they are diverse slices, but you actually want the probability potentially to weight each individual perspective equally and then go with the probability within those if you're trying to like weigh an individual perspective that is to give it the same kind of effect or influence or that kind of thing. I think this is a really interesting conversation to be happening on Juneteenth, in part because Juneteenth, Juneteenth is about, the liberation of enslaved people, and it's messy because it's not when it first started, right? Like, Juneteenth is the day of celebration when the rest of the enslaved people got that message, and I believe that happened in Texas, but
Yeah.
slavery yeah, you wanna
I just want to add to that point, which is it's interesting that there was bias in information
Yes.
that resulted in the enslaved people of Texas not learning, in this case, deliberately biasing the information available, in the hands of the enslavers, uh, so that it was much, much later. I forget when the actual Emancipation Proclamation occurred, but it wasn't until June 19th that finally the information was allowed to be disseminated to the Black population in Texas that they had been emancipated many months earlier. But
Right.
the Texans wanted to keep them enslaved. So as a result, they biased the information sources by suppressing the news.
Mhm.
And isn't that really what happens to a large degree in our current news media since the elimination of the fairness doctrine? The fairness doctrine was really what I mean by alignment that addresses the edge cases, right? Make sure that alignment, our processes of alignment to ensure alignment with human interest, actually incorporates or encompasses the perspectives of those people who are marginalized.
Mhm.
So yeah.
So so here's one of the points that came up. Sometimes I prep for the show. When I have time, I prep for the show by having a conversation with ChatGPT before I have a conversation with my co-host. And one of the things that came up was that if we look at what slavery was, right? In terms of the economic impact and the cause of the Civil War and those kinds of things, slavery was an economy where value was extracted without fair compensation, right? Where labor was invisible, dehumanized, and unaccounted for. And is that are we were just replaying this when data is scraped, behaviors are modeled, cultures are learned from, but there isn't a compensation factor for the people who are creating the value. The value is extracted, and then that is that is something that the individual people who extracted it are reaping the rewards from it, and then sharing it out to us who are very in the room, not in the room of the frontier lab, fundraisers or any of that stuff, but we are definitely in the bubble in paying attention, right?
So that concept of digital colonialism, right? I think that's one of the articles that we were researching about it, and I think this kind of crosses over to any marginalized community or culture, right? That aren't part of the dominant group, like Andy was mentioning. Is it's not just it's not just a matter of what is happening, it's why and how, right?
Mhm,
Even if the idea is, "Oh, we wanna add this quote unquote dying language," right, to our data set so that we can help propagate it, right, and have that within the larger data set. It's important to understand the history coming into that. What does that sound like to that group? And what are and you kind of wanna get You want to get that level of trust and communication and understanding going in and getting that consent, because that's when you will get what the true value is from including the language,
Mhm.
right? From a technical standpoint, a lot of indigenous people's languages are much different, like vastly different linguistically
Mhm.
than modern languages like English or German or anything like that. And one of the things that it adds to the overall training of AI is to be able to recognize, because it's all pattern recognition, right? You said predictive modeling. So it helps the AI learn these additional pattern matching sets and processes and thinking so that it becomes better. Right.
Mhm.
If you're presented, "Oh, here's a new group of languages. This is the outcome. This is what this means." And and if you've done any study with various indigenous peoples, there's usually much more subtext
Mhm.
than what is the apparent surface level, right? For a quick analogy, it's all iceberg. So
Right.
in language, what you see above the water is a tiny percentage of what the actual meaning is, because that's all contextual. That's all matters when something happened, to whom, what the environment was, geographically speaking, temporally speaking, and all of those kinds of things, right? That it's a much heavier weight than what you're just hearing. And so that kind of development is vastly valuable to an organizations that's looking to improve how their software or how their product interprets thought, right? Because language is sort of the expression of thought. And so we can see what that value is, but if it's all about being the right people at the right time in the right place for the right reasons, right? That kind of concept. And so, I think that's one of the things that when it goes back to that alignment question is like, all right, you're going so quickly and you're doing things that you think this is the right way to do things. But because your viewpoint is homogenized, right? Where you're within your own bubble and you're with and your own group think, right? You don't automatically see it. Not intentionally, but because of that, you don't have the perspectives that would add more to you down the road. Right? And unfortunately, humans in general are short-sighted, right? Our lives are short. We see about 20 to 40 years before or after. This is kind of what we remember, and that's how we adjust the things. So it's very difficult to sit down and go, okay, what does this mean in 100 years? What does this mean in 200 years? Right? What can we learn from 100 or 200 years ago? And those kinds of processes. And so I guess, oh, go ahead.
You're making me wonder, because I understand and agree, with the language is built upon a culture that has a foundational experience, environment, all of those kinds of things that influence the way that the language is, communicated, perceived, and I'm curious if could we do an experiment with AI and preference, like, a particular, worldview from a culture, right? So, one of the stories that I come up with in my that I've read at various times is, like, volunteers going to a community in Africa. They have a race. The winner of the race receives, I don't know, something like a bag of fruit or something like that. And the idea of winning and being able to get all the resources for yourself as winner was not something that made sense in this community, right? Resources, yay. Yeah, okay. So I give it to my co-racers. Like the race was won and now like the resources are shared. That's just because that is like a paradigm within that community. And I'm just curious, like could I set up AI in a way that says, okay, hi, I'm Beth. I am American. So I would like you to be, I would like to interact with you and I would like you to translate for me the times in which my individual exceptional, right? Like, I'm not trying to piss anybody off, but, Americans are raised with the idea that we individually are very important and often exceptional, right? Like, well, that's just a thing. Um, we also know that we're not some sort of but, like, could I create a custom GPT that would just surface awareness about that for me? That's really what I'm trying to say. Can we can we preference a different paradigm so that we can see each other so I can see myself from a different perspective, so we could see each other from a different perspective that is not the one that we were born into and is a native understanding for us, for me.
Very interesting. I want to address something that's surfacing in the chat, which is representative of a concern that inclusion of an equal voice or equal weight to marginal groups' point of view has the potential of eliminating the natural distribution of that exists because of the original marginalization, right? Because the dominant group has more population or whatever. And I want to just bring back in the mathematical equalization or reconciliation of that, which is the averaging concept. Like in the research that's been done by IBM Think Insights, which is one of the sources of the discussion here, both back in 1972 in concert with Wharton College, and now in a new publication that's just come out that is basically making the technical case for inclusion and the mathematical bases for ease. There's always the idea that these are averages. So while a marginal group, may have a different and important addition in terms of its contribution to the overall collective, it is put in there in its averaging at the weight that that marginalized group represents. So it's not like the attention to inclusion of the marginalized group automatically outweighs the importance and predominance of the already dominant group. But what it does do is at least gives a correctly weighted voice to the currently marginal position. And then, the whole idea of equity, as I understand it anyway, is trying to correctly balance that to eliminate the biases that produce their marginalized state in the original case. And this argument for averaging applies equally to data sources as it does to this ghostly, attendant discussion that we're having that surrounds the Juneteenth model here about how a population that had an outweight contribution to the building of America but was uncompensated for that. That their marginalization has systemic continuation that ought to be redressed. That's a different equity question that than the question of how do we include diverse and marginalized points of view in the correct calculation in order to get to the greatest collective accuracy in our AI and in our own perspective.
Yes. Um, and what determines the weight, right? So they're weighted appropriately. Is that um it's a conversation that I have with Junie sometimes, is that the amount of time that individuals put into that that led to the outcome, is that the individual contribution that most directly led to the profitability of the outcome, right? So, like, what are you how are you weighting individual contributions? First of all, is that time in? Is that like a paradigm shift, right? Which can happen really quickly, but doesn't do a lot of time, but actually makes a bunch of things change, right? So, what are we weighting? And then, how are we defining the outcome? And how are we assigning value to the outcome? And I think one of the things that's a challenge in this is that, and that I surface periodically. I understand that we can't do this without people who have access to billions of dollars, but people who have access to billions of dollars are very different than the vast majority of people who don't have access to billions of dollars. It's just you have a different perspective, right? And they're the ones making the decisions about how things get weighted and what is the desirable outcome.
Well, I think you identify some clear so within the context of our AI development or the AI part of this discussion is there's a lot more factors or vectors in which we have to take a look at to get the benefit of what Andy was talking about in the very beginning with the
Mhm.
diversity and the inclusion and getting those perspectives in there to give us a better or more advanced result, right?
Mhm.
How we progress in whether it's just the productivity, the intelligence, the all of those various factors. And so I think what isn't often talked about and what's lost in a lot of the AI hype cycle is, hey, these are some uh, key vectors that we have not really addressed in our um, in our plethora of different paths that we are researching to develop better AI, to
Mhm.
reach AGI, to reach super intelligence, right? And one of those is just the basic concept of crap in, crap out, right? We got to make sure our data is the best data. How do we make it the best data? How do we develop that data set to be better? The people making the data and the people collecting the data, how do we make those points better? Remember,
Mhm.
there's always gonna be a human hand, at least at this point, in that process. And if we don't make, to use a bread analogy, if we don't make the starter really good. We can't we can't help it along at the end. We can't just add something at the end to make the bread better. We gotta make the starter better, right? And that's where our hands get into it, right? So, like you said, Beth, uh, how about the investment side of things, the fiscal side of things, those, perspectives? How do those need to be analyzed and improved upon? The direct hands that go into the dough. How do we improve upon that? Where we're sourcing the ingredients, the flour, yeast, salt that goes into that bread recipe or into that starter. What, how is that the quote unquote best, for, developing into the best bread we've ever made? Or I think I can only take this analogy so far before it becomes really, really weird in terms of the bread making itself. But but I think I've made my point in we have to pay close attention and we have to have a certain alignment of what we want our overall goals to be. And that's what I mean from alignment in what we're putting in as the base ingredients of the foundation of letting it develop beyond that.
Right. And there's a lesson from improv in this, which is if everyone is making the most probable decision, the best, it's not a very good scene. What makes a good scene sometimes is the thing, and actually it's often the different perspective that seemed unexpected in the context of what was happening that lets the scene, like, have juice. "Oh, wow, that was interesting." Now we're all reacting to that, right? So what happens when what is not known to be best is added and makes it better? And that often happens by letting not the best in the room, right? Um, because by the definition of best, it's an exclusionary process. But, uh,
Right.
yeah,
It's a
Andy.
bias. It's a bias that we automatically put in because we already think that best is best. We're not getting too
Right,
confusing on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, circling back to what this portends for the future, in the development of AI specifically, uh, there are technical advantages to diverse teams that they mathematically reduce error rates and improve model performance when they have diverse perspective. By the way, when we think about diversity, when I do anyway, I think about the dominant U.S. culture being, white males, and we have a kind of a patriarchal society in that respect. But now, when you look at the research papers that are published and we collect from archive, think about the predominance of Chinese surnames on all the research
mm,
and the statistics that occur, now that show that, it's a vast multiple of the publications that are delivered by US sources that are delivered by China. Okay, so
right,
now China has a population that is, what is it at now? We have approximately 350 million, humans from the planet, in the United States of America, and who knows the number for China right now? I don't, it's well in excess of 1 billion, right? So it's at least 3 times, if not 5 times the population. So it's a larger pool, and it's equally possessed of educational opportunity and technology. And for all those reasons, the predominant culture that could lead to, a new kind of um, anti-diversity could be sourced from China, not the protection of the white privilege that we consider here in the United States. So anyway, I make that point as a tangent to the idea that diverse teams are mathematically superior when it comes to AI development. And importantly, also, there's business value to inclusivity because reaching the broadest market means not just getting the core of the distribution, but it's about getting the long tail. So customization and personalization in technology and in internet services, et cetera, is about, in many cases, customization for the purposes of capturing the very large portion that is in this tail end of the distribution. And that's the diversity that you're looking for. Customization is an address to diversity. You have a very peculiar and articulable set of requirements, Beth, that is different from mine. And in order to address your needs, the system has to be attentive to yours and not force you into choices that are in alignment with the majority, right?
right,
So that's the ability of technology and emerging technologies, particularly including AI, to address the entire population with all its variety, um, to the benefit of all and not just force everybody into the main sort of statistical band of the distribution.
right. So, many of you have heard, my origin story in AI was making sure that the the email that I was gonna send was business speak enough that it would be understood and replied to. So, I right, like, AI is my tool for education and all that stuff, but it also I, I use it periodically because it's an effective use of it to mask my diversity and make me sound more like someone who communicates like the dominant perspective or the dominant worldview. Now, this was about a Salesforce volunteering position, so, it wasn't like I was communicating, with the dominant position for something that mattered more than my own access to something. But I did totally recognize that I did not have that my language was not gonna reflect, that I belonged in the room without, some tweaking, because I just didn't have enough experience in that.
I want to share something that Cisco just posted on the thread here. Could infinite customization lead to echoization? Now that's a clever coining of a term there, where it feeds you what it thinks you want to see and experience instead creating greater islands between folks, as if that's not a problem now. Obviously, it is a problem uh, in social media particularly, because the algorithms are feeding you what you wanna hear as opposed to what is out there. Yeah, great point, Cisco, thank you.
Yeah, and the echo sorry, what were you saying?
Acquisition?
The infinite customization, I don't know, do you this is an argument that I am having with AI on a regular basis. We, like, have, and it's particularly, for the show, right? We get a premise, there's some real juice in there, we get a dossier, we have provocative questions. Now let's write the promo. And the promo is like, "Inclusiveness is a broadly beneficial experience for," and I'm like, "Where did you why? Why? We had great language. I just want you to put it in this format." Oh, so
Uh,
I think, yes, there is something so core to the bias inside it to make everything broader and more, um more probable that I think totally eliminates, the benefit of the rough edges, right? Like, I mean, that is an improv. That's essentially what an improv class or improv team is. You are all bouncing off each other. Some of you have edges where other people aren't expecting, and that interaction is what makes the juice.
yeah, that juice is the interest that we all have in something that's out of the ordinary and unusual. So I wanted to say that I believe that by hoovering up everything that's available that can be used as data, the AIs have all of that in there somewhere, but their probabilistic, algorithmic programming is is designed to give you what the central themes are as opposed to the edge case themes. So the responsibility for inclusivity and diversity in responses falls partly on you as the prompter.
Mhm.
And this goes back to my earlier comment about there ought to be a system prompt or custom instruction in what you do, or just a habit that you have when you're prompting to say, eh, give me these things and also give me the counterpoints and the exceptional arguments that are not consistent with that central argument, and also find diverse points of view or opinion in your sources that are in contrast to the main thread of my inquiry. Like that's really obtuse language for a prompt. Right. I would probably write it that way. And the AI would understand me, okay? But I don't do that today. but I have seen in certain prompt examples that people publish that there is that, like, ask for the ask for the counter argument.
Mhm.
In addition to the main argument that you're presenting in your thesis, give me the counter argument. What am I missing in this that would be brought in from an unusual or outlier case perspective?
Right. And just to build on that, I guess that would be my question to both of you is that's a fantastic jumping off point for this question is what are the practical things that we can do from the user side in whether it's in our prompting or our custom instructions or the way that we use in particular generative AI. What are practical, steps or ideas that we can implement? And Andy, that's a great, first one. Is there anything else that you all think, would be great additions to our own processes?
Well, I'm not sure this is in direct answer to that question, but the worst case examples that came out of the Google fiasco where, their generative imagery was, you know, inconsistent with reality because it was, by the system instructions, it was being biased in a certain direction. Uh, that was corrected subsequently, but whenever you see something that's unusual because it doesn't comport with, the way things really are, uh, like, having, what was the Google example where they had all the images were of a certain race, even though they were supposed to like a white Frederick Douglass, for example, generating everything in accordance with what the incomplete and inappropriate uh, central assumptions are about what images are based on the training from images that didn't have a fair representation of what the diversity of the human population is. Like, what we should do is we should uh, inform the model developer with feedback that this bias was presented to me. We have to be attentive to bias in order to be able to correct it. Now, they have teams internally that are worrying about that and working on it, but I think we also have an obligation to call out bias when we see it, and that importantly in the ongoing continuous training of AI systems.
Agree. And I'm also going to say that the corollary to that is to say yes first when bias is surfaced, right? One of the things that happens often when you are in a group, and you are the different voice is, that when you say, "Hey," uh, and you can hear it, right? I do not immediately go, "Wow, that was a really, biased statement," or "I love you all." Hmm. That was an example of mansplaining AI. Thank you, everybody. Right? Like there are things that happen that when it's the voice who's saying, "Hey, this is a bias. I can see that you all aren't experiencing that way, and I want to say it." That also needs to be accepted, right? And that is actually the harder part in my experience, both as someone who communicates about things that I'm experiencing that seem biased against me, and also things that I am biasing against someone else.
Yeah.
Um, and so I experience it both ways, and in my experience, it's braver to surface it, but it is hard to sit back if you are not comfortable with being like because it's like, "Hey, your worldview is missing a couple pieces. Let me, like, shove some of mine in there." That's an uncomfortable situation, but, but I think that's the other piece to this.
All right. Anybody have any last thoughts? This has been a great discussion. Thank you all, and thanks to everyone in the chat. Anything, Junmeen, to to add as a final point?
Well, I think this entire discussion has really got me thinking about how I want to invoke more complex or deeper discussions when I'm engaging with AI, right? And I've heard this term from a creator that I follow, CJ Trowbridge, and he had said that uh, AI was initially developed by the Soviets, right? The initial implementation or the concept, so that humanity can learn from itself. It's supposed to be a mirror, right? And so approaching the use of AI in that context to kind of eke out more information than what a quick answer is, right? So that I can more critically think or engage with whatever the information or conversation I'm having about that information. Uh, and I want to develop that a little more. That's kind of where my thinking is right now. And that might be a an interesting way of seeing how we overall interact with AI. Right now, a lot of the hype around it is what can it do as a tool? What can we build off of it? What's that business aspect? But can we get better better results or more analytical or in-depth thinking on results for longer term plays by instituting a deeper investigation of whatever we're trying to do. And so I'm not exactly sure how I want to approach that, but the idea of wanting to approach it and figuring out how I can tease out a more deeper conversation, that might be a good tool set or skill set for anyone who engages with AI or develops with AI.
Yeah, kudos to curiosity. So great. Well, thanks everyone. Join us tomorrow, by the way, for the Daily AI Show. Tomorrow, our story is AI for Good, stories worth telling. And come into the chat on YouTube, where our group collects every Monday through Friday, and contribute your own stories for how AI has served the good in your life and or in some event that you've observed out there. And also find us at thedailyAIshow.com. ThedailyAIshow.com will give you a link to our community where you can join a Slack community. It's free, and join some of the other people who are always talking about AI on a daily basis. And in addition, sign up for the newsletter because the newsletter comes out once a week and it is a really compact digest of what you need to know about AI that has emerged in that past week or is central to your understanding and development of your own skills in AI. So, with that, I turn it over to Beth to give us the outro. And thanks for listening.
Aloha.
Thanks all.